fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 27, Cryolite. 6 guards. Piper's wary eyes shifted over each of them, standing idly around her and her party with lazy disinterest. They held their weapons at the ready, but it was a half-hearted measure. Since their rescue from the rubble, she and her friends had been clapped in irons and marched to an out-of-the-way corner of the university grounds. When 2 of them took their gaze off her, she bent down, pretending to rub at her ankle. "Oi, short stuff! Any luck?" Evan let out several silent curses as he tossed a twisted lump of wire to the ground. Similar to the others, this pick was bent and warped beyond the point of saving. "I can't crack these cuffs, and that's weird, 'cause there ain't a lock out there that I can't pick." He tugged his hands apart, yanking at the short chain with a wail of frustration. Piper hissed a shushing noise through her teeth. "Do you want to get us in more trouble?" When the dwarf grew silent, she stood. "Just keep trying." She watched him roll his eyes and pull out yet another length of wire from one of his many pockets. She scratched at her cheek as she glanced at the others. Atticus was still scanning the wreckage with a worried expression, and Winter was behaving oddly. He was nervous and jumpy, glancing warily at every shadow that moved, pawing at his skin with manacled hands. She leaned over, nudging him with her shoulder. "Hey, are you all right?" Her touch sent jets of pain through his skin, and Winter leapt back. His eyes darted around the small clearing before landing back on his shaking fingers. Yeah." He offered her an unconvincing, toothy grin. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." Piper cocked an eyebrow at his skittish behavior. The grin faltered. How many years had it been since he felt the itch of the wolf beneath his skin? Winter had nearly forgotten the sensation of sandpaper scratching him raw from the inside, and the paranoid whispers in his mind that told him everyone and everything was out to get him. He rubbed at the base of his neck in an attempt to scrub away his worry. "I'm not, but I will be." More than just imagining itch beneath the surface, it unnerved him how close he had come to losing control, and that fear reverberated down his body, causing his fingertips to tremble. "I still don't see Unit 2. Atticus leaned over, as if it would give him a better view of the decimated buildings that lay before them. "I'm getting really worried. Do you think if I asked nice, the guards would let me go look?" Piper nearly let slip that there was no point, that Unit 2 was likely lost in the destruction, but she remembered that the robot was her brother's best friend, not just a machine. She put on a small smile. "I think it's best if we just let him find us. I'm sure he's totally fine and is probably hiding so they," she nodded her head towards the 6 guards, "don't find him." Atticus considered this for a moment before he nodded, agreeing with his sister. "I bet he's back at the workshop right now." "Where are they?" The sound of raised voices caught her attention, and Piper pulled away from her brother in time to see a man forcing his way through the bustling crowd of onlookers, soldiers, and the fire brigade. Chester all but knocked a man to the ground in his haste to burst through the line, his harried gaze scanning the heads until he found what his heart was looking for. "Piper!" He threw himself at them, sweeping her into one arm and Atticus into the other. "You're alive! How? Why were you even... No, none of that matters." He closed his eyes as he buried his face into her hair, kissing the top of her head, then her brother's. "Thank the scholar you're all right." She heard Atticus let out an assuring laugh and then telling Chester all about their escapades into nearly being blown to smithereens. But Piper had no words for the man. She merely stared at him, her breathing slow and calm. Pulling them out to arm's length, Chester noticed their bound hands and whirled on the nearest guard.
"What is the meaning of this?"
He gestured to the children.
"Unbind them, immediately!"
The man took a step back, stammering,
Sorry, sir. Our orders were to detain anyone found in the wreckage of the building. Do any of them look like Elias?"
Chester's usual slack smile was replaced by rage.
"Or remotely dangerous, for that matter?"
When the guard's face faltered, he rounded on the others.
"Lower your weapons at once!"
A murmur broke out among the other soldiers, and he realized that all of them were clad in red, that they were his to command, not the Brotherhood's. Chester's jaw tightened.
"Gentlemen, it appears you still have some ringing in your ears from the explosion and haven't heard me clearly. I said, lower your weapons at once and unbind them, or I will have your ranks and bring you up on charges of treason. I am still the Prime Minister, am I not?"
The scramble to follow his orders were near immediate, and Chester allowed himself a sigh of relief. He turned back to Piper and Atticus, waiting until they were free to pull them in once more.
"Let us get you two to someplace safe and find you a warm meal. Then we can talk."
Pulling in a deep breath for courage, Piper found her words. "He was my friend." Chester loosened his grip.
"Piper,
Tell me this wasn't you." She stared at him with cold determination behind watery eyes. "Tell me this was Elias, or the scholar. Tell me that you had nothing to do with this." Chester gave her a furtive glance.
I did what I had to do."
She didn't yell. She didn't curse or swing a fist, but her lips trembled as she pulled away. "You know, that was the same line the High Inquisitor once told me." He reached after her.
"I didn't want to, but one life to assure the safety of millions? What choice did I have?"
"Would you have done it if it were me, or Danny?"
"Of course not. We're family."
She shook her head, pulling her brother in behind her. "If you can't see why that answer is so wrong, then maybe we shouldn't be." A simpering noise of disapproval rang out, signaling the approach of a mousy man in elaborate robes.
"Why are the prisoners out of their bonds?"
Chester tried to catch Piper's eye, to relate his remorse, but she refused to meet his gaze. With a pang of guilt, he spun to see the voice of the jewel, Charles Brightworth.
"They are not prisoners. They are my family and guests. May we please have a moment alone?"
Folding his hands behind him, Charles came to a stop and glanced about the scene unfolding before him. The unused wing of the school had been all but obliterated, leaving a mess of concrete and twisted metal. The scant sections of walls that remained leaned haphazardly, creating a twisting maze of smoking rubble. And standing there, red-handed, was the Prime Minister's adopted children and two awkward-looking citizens. Pulling in a haughty sniff through his nose, Charles shook his head. "Prisoners, guests, whatever you choose to call them, they are to be detained."
"Under whose authority? And don't say the scholar."
Chester stalked forward, jabbing a finger at the mousy man like a dagger.
"This is still my city."
The voice of the jewel merely smiled, lifting one hand to placate the Prime Minister. Of course not. But Miss Ruby did ask to question these Guests. Charles lowered his hand. They gained access to a restricted building, attempted to free a prisoner of war, and compromised a top-secret operation. For all we know, they are in the employ of the mad tyrant himself. Chester glared at the little man.
Setting aside the fact that 2 of them were instrumental in deposing Elias from his rule over Avis, there is no evidence at all for your accusations. What could Ruby even hope to glean from them?
The location of the king and his duplicate, of course. We have yet to recover any bodies, and your wards were the last to see them alive. Piper's gaze shot over to the newcomer. Miss Ruby believes that applying the right pressure could—
Pressure?
Chester grabbed the man by his robes.
I'll be damned if she lays a hand on them.
The voice glared down his nose, losing his smug smile for the first time. Who are you to argue with the will of the scholar's most trusted advisor? The jewel would be well within her rights to do more than— Chester's fist sunk into the man's face, staggering him back. He was atop him a moment later, forcing the monk down into the dust and debris. But before he could strike again, hands grabbed hold of him from all around. He struggled, kicking down at the prone figure as his own guards hauled him off. The tiny man scrabbled to his feet, wide-eyed with fear and clutching at his bleeding nose as he turned tail and ran. Shoving his men off, Chester struggled to compose himself, his breathing heavy. As his heart hammered in his chest, righteous anger gave way to worry. He couldn't stand the sniveling monk, and only trusted Ruby as far as he could throw her. But they were beloved by the scholar, and he needed to keep the deity in his good graces. He tugged down the hem of his vest, straightening out his shirt, and tucked away the wayward strands of his hair. He would likely have to apologize for his behavior. But for now, he had a different bridge to mend. He turned, ready to face whatever accusations Piper had ready for him, only to find the small clearing now empty. His children and their friends had fled into the gathered crowd, and that sinking pit in Chester's gut told him exactly where they were headed. Big-bosomed barmaids, scantily clad librarians, a gaggle of incubi, fancy ladies with wings playing a harp, and a stone giantess lying in a bed of silk and goose down. Just to name a few of the delights Atlas imagined would be waiting in his heaven. Chances were he was about to find out. And, like all things in his life and afterlife, he wanted to have a game plan for when he got there. He pried open his one good eye, but it was much too dark to see, and he felt like the weight of the world was resting on him. Escape during the chaos, he had thought. They'll be too busy to follow. He frowned. His impromptu plan had worked a little too well. After the king had arrived, yelling something about needing to flee, he recalled a rumble that felt like the very earth was going to split open and swallow them whole, which, given his current situation, hadn't been that far from the truth. In his infinite wisdom, Atlas had chosen to abandon the others while they focused on not dying. To his credit, he had made it quite a ways before a wall collapsed on top of him. Atlas winced when some of the rubble around him shifted, and he felt something in his chest give a little pop. He wanted to sigh at his current situation, but that would require the ability to breathe. He pushed his hands against the roof of his stone coffin, but it failed to budge. A simple shielding charm had protected him from the worst of the damage, but if he didn't find a way out soon, he'd surely suffocate. As a plan came to him, Atlas licked his lips. He had just enough left in him to try another levitation spell. Well, that wasn't actually true, but he had learned long ago that denial was better than panic. He began tracing a faint, flickering rune against the nearest stone when there was a terrible crunching noise. As it filled the space around him, he knew that this was it. His barely powered spell must have been just enough to make things go from bad to worse. It was time to meet his maker. He wondered if whatever god that claimed his soul would be hot. He'd never had the chance to woo a god before, and welcomed the challenge. Just when he was ready to accept his end, something burst through the rock above him, peppering his face with dust and bits of shrapnel. A bright light shone down, and a face gleaming in gold, with eyes burning like fire, gazed down upon him. The otherworldly face spoke to him in tongues, a series of unintelligible noises, and, as his own eye adjusted, Atlas realized that God looked like a dented metal bucket. It was one of those blasted metal robots, or whatever they were called, like the ones that had attacked him during the ship heist. Thin, coiled metal arms snaked their way through the hole and began systematically removing sections of rubble, one piece at a time. As the massive weight was finally lifted from his chest, Atlas was able to suck in his first deep breath, and he instantly knew something was wrong. There was a gurgle in his lungs, and the pain that radiated throughout his torso did not bode well. Just once, he thought, he'd like a set of friends that didn't lead him into disaster, or end with him breaking a limb or getting shot at. The robot emitted a series of piercing sounds again, like metal scraping against slate, causing Atlas to attempt to scramble away from the machine. But as pain lanced through him, he only managed to collapse a few inches from where he was. The hulking creature lifted him carefully from the ground, pulling him free of the rubble and up into the sunlight. He could see now that the copper monstrosity had been badly damaged, even to his untrained eye, being that he only had one of them. It tried speaking again, but the only words he could make out from the static were
Atticus.
And
Medical.
Unable to argue, Atlas accepted his fate with a grunt as he closed his eyes and settled into the beast's arms. He wasn't sure what this metal man wanted, but at least it meant, for the moment, he wouldn't be hearing any of those harps today.
I still don't understand.
Vel scratched at the back of his neck as he watched the tiny red imp scrawl another something down on a length of yellowed parchment.
This, infernal plane is part of our reality?
No! Akaz wailed as he spun round, ripping out a tuft of hair in frustration before he yanked up the sheet of paper. He jabbed a long finger towards a sketch that clearly explained the concept.
Other way round? Why you no pay attention?
I am paying attention.
Vel's mouth formed a line as he snatched up the parchment. He turned it sideways, upside down, the other way, but it was no use.
This just looks like a badly drawn pinup. Or pizza, maybe?
Ah, dumb man!
Akaz harumphed and snagged back the piece of paper.
Good smarter than you. No more questions. Have work to do. Go away now.
He hopped back to his table, fuming, and jabbed his quill into a fresh sheet of parchment to begin translating the symbols on the dials of the tiny machine. Grumbling something about not being an idiot, Vel stood and glanced over the tiny imp's shoulder. The translations looked like math equations sectioned off into bracketed sequences. He frowned.
Am I supposed to be able to read that?
Akaz spun, jabbing the man in the leg with the quill.
Said go away! Go away!
Ow! Okay, fine.
Vel swatted at the tiny demon's hand, retreating as the sharpened feather repeatedly found its mark on his leg.
Just, come and get me when you're done.
He rubbed at the spot several times before he moved for the tent flap.
Little red jerk.
Growling to himself, Vel stepped out of the small canvas hut and took in a deep breath of twilight air. The sooner he could get to the kids, the sooner he could take a much-needed nap. Maybe even get an order of bacon. From what Rasizi had said, the trek to the tower, now located outside Avis, was roughly a 10-day journey by foot, assuming they hadn't found a herd of wild horses or something to speed up the process. But the chances of finding enough transport for a group of that size was practically zero. This meant he still had a bit of time to get there before them. All in all, he was feeling calmer now. Ever since the storm, he had been laser-focused on finding them, unsure if they were even out there. Just the knowledge that they had survived and that they were in the company of Evan and someone Pyra assured him was trustworthy, he could almost relax. Almost. His eyes drifted across the camp, looking for something akin to a tavern, when he spotted the queen sitting in the grass near the base of a large tree stump, just beyond the inn. Her legs were pulled up to her chest, with her arms wrapped around them. Vel took that to mean the family reunion had not gone well. He dragged a hand down over his mouth as he scanned around for Undine, hoping to send her in to take care of the situation, only to see that Rasizi had already put her to work, helping the crews build more makeshift lodgings. He grumbled to himself. He wasn't good at dealing with emotions, not anymore, and instead preferred to suppress them beneath large quantities of cheap alcohol. He snorted, already imagining the chewing out Piper would give him if she knew he had thought that. He sighed and began to trudge through the dry grass. He could see the gentle shake of her shoulders the closer he got, and her face was buried in her knees. Even though her sobs were silent, Vel could tell she was crying. He slowed, observing her for a moment before he sat down on the tree stump just next to her.
You okay?
Pyra gave a loud sniff, running her hand along her face to hide the evidence of her emotions before looking up at him. I'm quite fine.
Vel cocked an eyebrow as he looked down at her.
Wilting under such a gaze, Pyra turned away. My mother is in a dreamless slumber and may never wake. My father is missing, and my sister claims Elias is the cause of it all. She took in a shuddering breath, fighting back the tears in her eyes. Waging war on the Brotherhood once more, with no regard for the repercussions or who he hurts in the process.
Yeah.
Vel nodded slowly, letting out a heavy sigh.
Sounds about right. He was like that when I met him.
Driven to a fault. Pyra let out a tiny chuckle, but grew quiet as she shrank in on herself. It might be silly, but I hoped that after I went missing, he would have scoured the world trying to find me. But instead, he has laid waste to the universe, settling an old score with the Brotherhood. Her lips trembled. I'm lost, adrift in an unfamiliar ocean. I know he's a good man, that he can do great things. I do not know how to convince him to abandon this crusade. Reaching down, Vel placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Her eyes blurred with tears, Pyra looked up into that familiar yet foreign face. His expression was tender, but there was a weight in those mismatched eyes of his that caused her breath to catch in her throat. As the last of the waning sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, fireflies began to stir in the grass around them. Orange, glittering lights twinkled as they rose into the air, filling the space between them with a soft glow. Vel sucked in a deep breath, keeping his gaze locked on hers.
I've wanted to tell you this for some time now, but I never could find the right moment.
Pyra swallowed hard. Sure, he could hear her heart hammering against her chest. When did this emotion sneak up on her?
You're being an idiot.
He gave her shoulder another squeeze.
And you need to get your head out of your ass.
Pyra blanched, a choked noise of indignation struggling past her dropped jaw.
Excuse me?
She steadied herself as she stood.
I sit here, bearing my soul to you, and you tell me to get my head out of my ass?
Not to be outdone, Vel stood, giving her a level gaze.
You talk about getting back to him, helping him save people.
He shook his head. He hadn't been dishonest with her. This was something he had wanted to say to her since Ember Run.
We both know he did this.
He waved a hand towards the heart of the town full of refugees.
And from what I gather, you've seen him commit more atrocities than I have. He is a monster.
So I should just abandon my pursuit of him and let him continue on the path that leads to our people's ruin?
You don't strike me as the kind of individual that defines herself by another.
He folded his arms across his chest.
You keep talking about him, but what about you? What do you stand for? What is it exactly that you want? Or will you be content to play second fiddle to a madman?
That is not fair! Pyra moved closer, her anger bubbling to life. I have fought for my people, both in the courts and on the battlefield. Do not speak to me like I am some dainty princess afraid of stubbing a toe.
Yet here you are, shedding tears for a man that, by the sounds of it, hasn't given a second thought about you.
Pyra took a step forward, blood rising. He may not care about me, but I care about him.
Then you need to prepare yourself.
Vel put his hands on her shoulders once more, pushing her out to arm's length so that he may look her in the eyes.
If you reach him but can't change his mind, you'll need to make a choice. Either wallow in your sadness, pining for someone who's gone, or get up and do something.
She steadied herself and heaved a sigh.
You make it sound so easy. But what if you were in my position? Could you so easily choose?
When their gaze met, the weight of sadness in his eyes now made perfect sense. Pyra hadn't realized, but he was in the same position. Oh, your brother.
Elias didn't do this on his own. I know that. And I've made peace with my decision. It's time you make yours.
He removed his hands from her shoulders to gesture at his surroundings carefully.
These people could use a leader who was willing to guide them out of this.
She had more she wanted to say. More barbs ready to hurl at the cyborg for being so blunt with her. She wanted to lash out at him, to scream and cry against him. But she just stood there, the two of them alone in a field of fireflies. His words, however painful, rang true, and it made her realize that her recent actions, while under the guise of needing to get back to her husband, were just an excuse to avoid facing the truth. Her bodyguard was right. He had changed in their time apart. But it wasn't just time that had changed them. Something else was at work with her husband, and she needed to find him. Not to return to his side, but to stop him, one way or another. We thank you for joining us for this chapter of the novel of Portals and Portents, Book 4 by Lesley Herron in this ongoing series available here on Tall Tale TV. You can find links in the description to where you can listen to all her books and novellas, with new chapters appearing as they are being written and recorded. Ladies, attention please. First of all, I want to say just how proud I am of all of you. For Laura, the strawberries are the ripest I've ever seen, plump and firm. And Esmeralda, your honeyed mead is sweet enough to put the bees to shame. And of course, let's not forget Mistress Eserizen. Your leatherworking skills on the bondage gear is sublime. In all my eons, the realm of desire has never looked so grand. But alas, I bear unfortunate news.
Oh, no. What? No.
Yes. I'm afraid the Chosen One was saved from the brink of death. Again.
Seriously? So much work into his arrivals this
It
time.
may not be the outcome we wished for, but you should take pride in what you have achieved here. And fear not, for he cannot escape death forever. Someday, our champion will arrive, and on that day, we will be ready.
Are you sure we can't just smite him?